Thank you for publishing this essay, which I worked on off and on for 20 years. It's anchored in an experience I had when I was living in St. Louis. In fact, it takes place in St. Louis, it begins in St. Louis, then it takes place about 2 hours away from St. Louis in a place called Potosi. So I'm going to try to read enough to get the arc of the story, by way of excerpts within my 15 or 20 minutes. That's about the time I have, right? See if I can do that. After my first wife and I decided our marriage was a bad idea, and I had just moved into my new apartment where I was living alone with a little furniture and a lot of books in boxes stacked halfway to the ceiling, enjoying a newfound freedom, sitting naked in my grandfather's wooden rocking chair, I finally read Jack Kerouac's On the Road, his romance of crisscrossing the country looking for the father figure he never found. My own father had died when I was not quite 14, of a cancer that was diagnosed 3 weeks before his death. I remember a day alone with him in the house, standing beside the bed watching as he vomited what looked like blood that he couldn't get up fast enough to keep from staining the sheets. He sat up, castigating himself. I hope the hell I'm happy. I stood there afraid of him, not knowing what I should do, and said he shouldn't blame himself. He answered, "It makes more work for you and Mom." About a week later, he was dead. So it's no great trick for me to get pulled into a book about an absent and damaged father, like the alcoholic and stumbling figure of old Dean Moriarty in Kerouac's novel. From this distance of 20 years, I've come to think that I must have sat there alone in my new apartment, sitting in my grandfather's rocking chair, reading, naked as the day I was born, looking for some new identity. As a teenager, I'd been a die-hard, dyed-in-the-wool romantic, though I couldn't have said what a romantic was. I devoted myself to writing poetry and reading whatever poets were around. William Cullen Bryant, George Moore, Carl Sandburg, Leonard Nimoy. Because somehow I'd gotten the idea that it was the sort of thing poets did, I sat on the banks of the Ohio River, reading and writing, gazing at the water. Sometimes I wrote poems in the sand for the tide to carry away. I was so romantic a young man as to be a danger to myself and others, and probably should have been institutionalized. The institution I finally found was college, which for me was a seminary run by Benedictine monks, where I studied ancient metaphysics and deconstruction, along with more poetry than I knew existed. Under the direction of Father Blaise Hettick, I came to love John Donne, John Milton, Emily Dickinson, Jared Manley Hopkins, and T.S. Eliot. I read The Wasteland over and over and became a confirmed classicist, which for me meant a lover of discipline, learning, especially learning in those texts known as the classics, and old-fashioned realist metaphysics. Inspired by Eliot and a few others, such as the Thomist philosopher Joseph Pieper, I tried really hard to become a conservative and didn't understand why I couldn't mesh with American political conservatism until I realized I would have to believe in the almost magic efficacy of the free market to solve problems that really need something more like mindful regulation. Which is, after all, what the Church teaches as in Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which decrees the basic human right to a just wage, independent of market forces. I like to think that my sensibility could never settle on something like a singular brand of conservatism anyway, any more than it could settle on a singular version of classicism, liberalism, progressivism, or Catholicism. If deconstruction and the better angels of my faith taught me anything, it is that we need to get past such simplistic notions. But it has taken me a long time to get back in touch with my romantic roots. Probably this is for the best. Given how conventionally and even stereotypically romantic I was to begin with, had I thrown myself into romantic devotion, I probably would have evaporated. I would have missed the discipline and learning that went into the making of the romantic movement. So sitting there in my grandfather's rocking chair, I must have been seeking some kind of rebirth out of the energies that were calling me back through the Beats, to Yeats, to Shelley, Blake, Milton, and the Bible, especially those Vatican enigmatic texts, Isaiah, the Apocalypse, and the sayings of Jesus. Kerouac's book was then speaking to me in ways that even now I'm figuring out. The similarities between the narrator's life and mine were striking, though they didn't much strike me at the time. Here's the opening of On the Road. I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up. I had just gotten over a serious illness that I won't bother to talk about, except that it had something to do with the miserably weary split up and my feeling that everything was dead. With the coming of Dean Moriarty, I began the part of my life you could call my life on the road. Not only had I just split up with my wife, I'd also just gotten over my own serious illness, a bout of depression that led me to take some time off work to attend a 2-week outpatient program for adult children of alcoholics and other addicts. I had my own feelings of deadness and was looking for ways to feel alive. So I'm going to skip ahead now. So there was this place, it was a coffee shop called Ibbott's, which was connected to a bookstore. It was about 10 miles across town. I'd go spend time there and read Wallace Stevens and work on my poems and grade papers. I was teaching at a high school at the time. And there were these guys I'd hang out with. They were, some of them were students at Washington University and hipsters who wandered up and down Del Mar Boulevard. It was a steamy night that I went outside with those guys to watch Stu's running up the wall trick. A sideways leap and a couple of steps along the bricks before landing on his feet. We offered mild applause. As an encore, Stu pulled out his harmonica and played a bluesy rendition of If I Were a Rich Man. About this time, I noticed, as if he'd materialized there, a freakishly thin, barefoot man wearing a blue shirt and pair of pants, along with a beat-up planter's hat. He looked to be in his late 20s, though the sun had aged his face to a leathery early old age. His voice was unobtrusive and clear. If you have a set of drums, I could play along with you. Stu acted like he was checking through his pockets and responded, "No, I sure don't have any." He and his 2 friends were moving toward the door. Robert launched into a story about a time in Italy at a sidewalk cafe when he heard someone play the same tune on glasses with different levels of water. Bada bada bing bang, he demonstrated, waving his hands in mimicry of banging out the tune. And bang, the man accidentally broke a goblet made of fine crystal, whose owner pulled out a gun. But what the guy with the gun didn't know is that the player of the tune was in the mafia. So his guys around the table all pulled out their guns at the same time. Everybody just ran. Our new companion closed his eyes and laughed. Maybe it was the way he stood there looking helpless in the hot night, his hands in his pockets and that shirt hanging off him like a sack, that led me to introduce myself. "Pleased to meet you, sir," he answered. "My name is Robert. My people live down in Potosi." I asked if he would like a sandwich. "Yes, sir," he answered. I stopped at the corner of the building. "Would you like some coffee, too?" "Yes, sir," he said. So I go in and I get him some coffee, and we sit down and talk for a while. And I'm just struck by his vulnerability and just he's clearly making up all these stories. Like he told while I was going to I went home actually, got some of my running shoes. He had these really swollen feet, and so even though he was a lot smaller than I, my shoes fit him just fine. And I got some sandwiches together and just decided, by the time I got back to him, he said, "Well, my mom has to go into the hospital. I just got off the phone, and she says she's not going to go into the hospital unless I'm there." Clearly, he was just making all of this up. He was creating a narrative within which he was important, and it made his life livable. That was my inference. So anyway, I decided, all right, fine, we'll drive down to Potosi. Robert and I were on the road by 11 o'clock that night. I stopped to get some gas and bought him a pack of cigarettes, and we were cruising along, listening to country music on the radio, eating sandwiches I'd thrown together, and talking stream of consciousness. Mostly I just listened. He asked if I wanted to hear the theme song from Smokey and the Bandit, which he sang all the way through with the promise of a reprise later. He talked about his job at the high-tech agency, his father's underground dealings with the Nicaraguan Contras, and how his whole family had almost been in a movie. Apparently, this high-tech agency had super-secret dealings with governments all over the world, and Robert was crucial to its operations. He smoked the whole pack of cigarettes on the drive down. When a song that he especially liked came on the radio, he played phantom mystic drums, his hands, lighted cigarette between his fingers, floating and bobbing to the roof of the car and fluttering back down. "People tell me to sit still when I listen to music," he said, "but I gotta move." As we drove on through the night, he moved and he talked and talked. "Did you see that? Did you see that?" he yelled. There was 2 lights flying together and they just separated. He spread his hands wide to show how the lights had flown across the sky in opposite directions. I started thinking that Robert saw a lot of things that I was not privy to. More and more I thought about how much he was creating all of these stories so that he could have a reality where he could live, a world where he mattered. It has taken me a long time to realize that I was desperate to do the same thing. Maybe that's why I was drawn to him. My marriage hadn't worked out, my writing was stalled, and I was generally much more alone in my life than I could acknowledge at the time. Here was a master of creating his own story, and even though his was not the kind of narrative I wanted, I couldn't help but admire the virtuosity with which he seemed to convince himself that everything he said was true. I just wanted to create the conditions of a narrative that I could live with in the world. He grabbed my hand and led me through an elaborate handshake. Blood brothers, he declared. I nodded. So we finally get through. He directs me to his father's house, along these back roads. And his father actually lived in this cul-de-sac with, it was a cul-de-sac of trees. It was in a trailer, and there's trash all over the yard. And I remember at the time, I actually thought, oh, this is the part of the story where I'm killed. And I remember locking my wallet in the glove compartment of the car, thinking, well, at least the police would have a clue as to the next of kin. So anyway, finally, Father. So it's like 1 in the morning at this time. So if Robert goes and gets his father, and so now he's introducing me. He signals for me to come in. Daddy, this is my friend from St. Louis. He's a school teacher. Pleased to meet you, Robert's father said. From the waist up, his skin was deeply tanned and wrinkled. His face looked beaten up by sun and weather. His legs were sinewy and ghostly pale. The inside of the trailer smelled like a well-used litter box, though I never saw any sign of a cat. A late movie played on the television in the living room. I sat down on a dusty chair, and the old man, he never said his name, explained that the TV had been on for 3 solid years, ever since he'd moved in. I even listened to it in my sleep, he said, primly crossing his legs knee to knee. He had no teeth, but he had these beautiful cornflower blue eyes that lit up when he smiled. Daddy, Robert intoned, do you remember that medal you used to have on the dashboard of your truck? Who's going to get that, when you decease? The old man stared into space. I don't remember what it is you mean, Robert. It was that silver thing you always had on your dashboard when we was kids. It was there by the sink the last time I was here. Oh yeah, he nodded in recognition. Can I have that when you decease? No, nobody gets my medallion. Jimmy says he gets it. Don't nobody get it. A chase scene with squealing tires and gunfire drew our attention to the TV. The old man abruptly got up and disappeared into the kitchen and came back as far as the doorway to tell me in an almost confidential tone, here's what he's talking about. I stood and took it from him, a heavy, thick, hand-sized rendition of the Sacred Heart. My grandmother had a print of the Sacred Heart in her bedroom. Jesus with his hand on his wounded heart, which, crowned with thorns, emits an intense light. The piece of metal in my hand was just the wounded heart, the rays of light made of the same metal, forming a jagged edge. It was intensely gaudy. The Sacred Heart, I said. It's lovely. When I handed it back to him, he held the edge against his bare chest. You throw this good and it'd go right through somebody, wouldn't it? His eyes gleamed as he smiled. I told you Daddy's hands was registered as weapons, said Robert, who had come up behind me. We stood in the kitchen talking a few minutes, then went back to the living room and ate some ice cream. Robert was telling a story about how he'd been shot in the shoulder with a zip gun the previous week. These 3 kids came up to me in a dark alley. 2 of them grabbed my arms and the other pulled out. Now, Robert, his father interrupted, I told you about that lying. Robert shook his head. I ain't lying, Daddy. Now stop it. He didn't sound so much angry as determined. Robert leaned back with his head down. What line of work are you in? I asked the father. He said, right now I'm out of work, but I've done all kinds of things. I've painted bridges, worked construction, fixed cars, done farm work. For a while I even dug graves. Right now I'm trying to get that truck running. He pointed toward the yard. Yeah, I said, I saw that engine hanging out there. What do you plan to do next? Well, come Tuesday I'm supposed to appear in court for a DWI. This is my 3rd time, and they say if I don't get off, they'll send me up. He spoke casually, like he was talking about a ball game or the weather. He took a sip of his beer. Robert asked about his belongings, some clothes and other things. "They're in those bags out in the yard," his father answered. "I didn't know when he was coming back." Robert was almost in tears as he strained out the window to see out the window. "What are they doing out there?" "Like I said, I didn't know when he was coming back." Robert turned to me. "Come out here, I want to show you something." Outside in the dark, he said, "I can't stay here. He's been drinking. There's no telling what he'll do to me." I'd been looking forward to driving back to St. Louis alone, but he really sounded scared. So I took him back to St. Louis, and he wanted to stay. He said, "They know me at the state hospital, and I'll just go there." And they didn't let him stay. So he just said, "Well, just put me back out there in Kings Highway." And so, that's what I did. Just dropped him off. He wanted to come to my apartment to use my phone, and I didn't think I wanted to let him do that. We had said blood brothers, but blood brothers don't do that, do they? Just drop somebody off and leave him go. I remember I dropped him off, and I drove about 2 miles down the street and then back. I wanted to see what he was doing or if he was okay. And he was just sitting on, it was about 3, 4 in the morning at this point. He was just sitting on the wall of this high school, just looking utterly confident, utterly alone. And, then I pick up here. I went, there's a priest I knew at Jesuit Hall, Father Ong, and I talked to him about it a little bit. I was also looking for a new narrative to live by, like I saw Robert doing. Father Ong agreed that the stories Robert concocted about playing a crucial role in the high-tech agency and so forth were his ways of coping with a difficult life. Was my gesture of taking Robert to see his father itself a part of a narrative in which I mattered? I think so, but I believe I was also getting back in touch with a part of myself and my spirituality that I had earlier lost, the romantic sense of the burning radiance and particularity of every moment, every event, person, and thing. If classicism, in at least some of its manifestations, drives toward the universal, then romanticism, in the form I mean here, is drawn into particularity, the things counter, original, spare, strange, that Father Hopkins celebrates, and which move him to praise the divine. On the Road partakes of this celebration of the particular and the holiness of every burning moment, even in the midst of its considerable misogyny, homophobia, and fetishism of the other. I'm talking about On the Road here, such as the Mexican people that Sal and Dean salivate over near the end of the book. Among the least convincing passages is Sal's apologia for Dean in the face of the criticisms that he gets guys all jazzed up and irresponsible so that they leave their responsibilities behind. It's a criticism that would be difficult to disagree with, though Sal tries to do so by drawing a connection between how beat Dean is and the beatitude that they seek. More than one member of Kerouac's circle regarded Neil Cassidy as a psychopath in need of constant stimulation, a description that fits Dean Moriarty as well, because one is the same as the other, with his predatory searches for teenage girls and his readiness to abandon friends and lovers for the promise of more kicks farther down the road. Can there be any connection between such banal and dysfunctional detachment and attunement to the beatific beauty of every person's quirks and odd habits, a sensibility ready to dig the sadness and strangeness, the mystery and miracle of every person and moment? The person who first taught me the art of seeing the world in this way, its counter-original spare strangeness, now lives with his mother in an alcoholic haze, not unlike what happened to Kerouac. Maybe it's simply a matter of the hazards of going off the social script, which can be both liberating and precarious. It may also be that tapping into the energies that the beats in their best moment nude requires also a strict discipline. One might need to be, in other words, something like a romantic classicist or a classic romantic. This may be why such a writer as Thomas Merton did well to become a Trappist monk. It was his great genius to combine Cistercian spirituality with the earthy frankness of a beat voice, which comes across most strongly in his journals, the latter of which surely came in no small measure from the cultural milieu of New York City, and especially Columbia University in the 30s and 40s, both of which were important to Merton and the Beats. One of the great movements of 20th century theology was the breakdown of the binary between the sacred and the profane. Writing in the wake of the Romantics and their progeny, such as Dickinson and Hopkins, the Beats at their best were exploring the particularities of the sacredness of the secular, the holiness of the world. These are among the issues that I spent many years discussing with my friend Jim, who teaches theology at the prep school in St. Louis, where I had my first job. That morning after I dropped Robert off, I went home and fell into bed for a couple of hours, then got up to meet Jim for breakfast. I told him all about my adventure of the previous night. Like Robert, I wanted someone to hear my story. Thank you very much.